George Washington's letter is not the blank check some think it is. Predictably, rather than engaging the historical argument, some will attempt to label any disagreement as anti-Semitic, to criminalize dissent. Equality demands the opposite. Arguments stand or fall on evidence, not ethnic immunity. To transform George Washington's 1790 letter to the Truro Synagogue into a sweeping moral declaration that Judaism is not merely included in the American project, but that it sits at the moral center of it, wrapped in piety, dripping with solemnity, and armed with selective history, Goldstein doesn't so much honor Washington's words as conscript them into a modern narrative of entitlement that Washington himself would have rejected outright. This isn't about whether Jews deserve safety in America. They do, absolutely, unequivocally, without qualification. That is the point of Washington's letter. The problem is when that assurance morphs into historical revisionism, while marginalizing the overwhelmingly Christian moral and historical forces that actually birthed the Republic. And that is where honesty must intervene. The people who fled persecution, who crossed oceans, who built settlements, who drafted founding documents, and who constructed the moral architecture of the Republic were overwhelmingly Protestant Christians. They were not perfect. Their theology wasn't always coherent. Their politics were often contradictory. They failed in ways that scar our national memory forever, but their motivation was unmistakable. They were the persecuted. They were the ones fleeing religious tyranny. They were the ones asserting, long before Washington wrote a single letter, that rights derive from God, not kings, governments, priesthoods, or ethnic elites. This idea did not emerge from Jewish civic tradition, although historically there are similar overtones to the Israelites fleeing Egyptian tyranny. It came from Reformation Christianity, English common law, Enlightenment natural rights theory, and the theology of the New Covenant, precisely the spiritual development the Judaic establishment rejected. America did not emerge from Jewish covenantal political philosophy, but there are indeed echoes of it in the American ethos. To the point, America emerged from Christian dissent, Christian conscience, and Christian courage. Goldstein's essay airbrushes this reality out of existence, and it somewhat defies any logic as to why. The Constitution does not institutionalize ethnocentric moral authority. It dismantles it. It ensures that no group can claim privileged moral ownership of our nation. Romans 11 is not a political contract. Goldstein's use of Romans 11 to bolster his argument is another act of conflation. When Paul describes Christianity as grafted into the root of Abraham, he's speaking about salvation history, not political entitlement, foreign policy, or civic hierarchy. This is an important distinction because while Christianity acknowledges spiritual lineage, it does not subordinate itself politically to Jewish, social, or ideological identity. Yet Goldstein treats the letter as if it places Judaism at the philosophical center of the American experience. Christianity's covenant is not adjudicated by ethnicity. Its authority is Christ, not Jerusalem, not the Sanhedrin, and not the ethnic descendants of Abraham. And Goldstein seems to blur theology and politics in ways that mirror the very trends he claims to oppose. Washington said no such thing. His promise to the Jewish community was not a theological confession. It was a constitutional guarantee. Washington affirmed equal protection, equal citizenship, freedom of conscience. He did not declare Jewish custodianship over American moral authority, Jewish spiritual primacy in the Republic, or Jewish entitlement to moral deference. Washington advanced equality, not spiritual, theological, or institutional hierarchy. Here is the maturity Goldstein refuses to embrace. Jewish communities flourished in America because the Christian-informed founders built a nation safe enough for them to do so. That flourishing does not translate into moral proprietorship over the nation's founding ethos, which is to say, gratitude is honorable, entitlement is corrosive. What Goldstein wants is precisely what Washington denied: a moral elevation of one religious identity over the rest under the cloak of historical righteousness. If this argument came from a Christian political operative claiming America belongs spiritually to Christians, Goldstein would call it theocratic arrogance. If it came from a Muslim activist claiming constitutional moral primacy, he'd call it ideological colonization. But because the assertion is wrapped in Jewish moral trauma and historic persecution, it seems he expects silence. And all things being equal, this is little more than weaponized sanctimony dressed as historical reflection. Whenever politics begins to ground itself in ethno-religious entitlement narratives, liberty loses oxygen. That is precisely what the founders feared. Rights are God-given, but ownership is not. Washington promised safety, not sovereignty. He promised equality, not supremacy. He promised belonging, not proprietorship. America was not built as a Jewish nation, any more than it was built as a Catholic nation or an Islamic state. It was built as a constitutional civilization with a distinctly Christian moral engine and a universally applicable guarantee. America is not morally indebted to Judaism. America is morally committed to liberty for everyone. That is the America Washington envisioned.